on international collaborative trends, research trends in graduate education, and what is emerging on the front of funding and policy. I'm Henning Schroeder. I am Dean of Graduate Education here at the university, and I've just returned from a one-year stay in Washington, D.C. with the National Science Foundation and the Council of Graduate Schools as their Dean in Residence. And I am extremely thrilled to welcome the two leaders today here in Minneapolis that I had the pleasure, privilege, and honor to work with during that year that ended in September this year in Washington, D.C. Suzanne Ortega from the Council of Graduate Schools and Valerie Wilson from the National Science Foundation. And again, thank you for coming to Minneapolis. And we are very lucky that we have 2014 and not 1991, because in that year, on this very day, on Halloween, the weather dropped 2 feet of snow on Minneapolis. So we are really lucky, and it looks like we will have a great snow-free day today. But let's get back from the weather to our two distinguished guests. Valerie Wilson is currently the Acting Division Director of Graduate Education, DGE, at the National Science Foundation. She is responsible for guiding several cross-foundational programs that directly support graduate students, as well as institutions with innovative models of graduate education. Dr. Wilson was, before she came to the NSF, Associate Provost and Director of Institutional Diversity at Brown University. She was also Associate Dean of the Graduate School at Brown University, and prior to her tenure at Brown, she led the Center for Bioenvironmental Research at Tulane University. In the early 90s, she directed the Division of Health Sciences Policies at the Institute of Medicine, part of the National Academy of Sciences. And Dr. Wilson holds a PhD in molecular biology from the Johns Hopkins University. One of the things that I was very surprised at or by while I was working with Valerie at the NSF was to learn about the fact that funding for international experiences for graduate students was there, but it was underutilized. There were not enough applications coming in, so some years ago, that funding was cut, it was abandoned. However, in recent years, the NSF has introduced and reintroduced programs and funding mechanisms for grad students to do research abroad that are very attractive, and we will hear about those programs from Dr. Wilson. And I also think we should use today's forum as much as possible for a dialogue, to hear from you really what you view as the benefits of going abroad and doing research in other countries as graduate students, but also to hear about from you what are the barriers or potential barriers that keep you from doing that, and what we can do. Those can be financial or administrative barriers, and what we can do, funding agencies, the Council of Graduate Schools, and the university itself, to remove these barriers or make them easier to surmount or bypass. But before we go to the NSF side, the funding agency side of international graduate education, we will hear about the Council of Graduate Schools perspective. Suzanne Ortega became the 6th president of the Council of Graduate Schools on July 1st of this year. And prior to assuming her current position, she served as the University of North Carolina Senior Vice President for Academic Affairs, and previous appointments included Executive Vice President and Provost at the University of New Mexico, and Vice Provost and Graduate Dean at the Universities of Washington and Missouri. Dr. Ortega's master's and doctoral degrees in sociology were completed at Vanderbilt University. And one sentence about the Council of Graduate Schools. This is an organization that has over 500 members, and you can talk about this much better than I can, Suzanne. 500 member institutions of higher educations that are all engaged in graduate education in the United States, in Canada, and some overseas, and the University of Minnesota is one of these members. CGS's mission is to improve and to advance graduate education, which it achieves through advocacy in the federal policy arena, research and the development and dissemination of best practices. Now, when you go to CGS's website, which you should all do, you will see that among the core activities of CGS lists very prominently global engagement. And this is why we look forward to hearing about CGS's and your perspective on emerging trends in international collaborations in graduate education and research. Thank you very much, and I'll turn it over to Suzanne.
Thanks so much, Henning, and thanks for all of you to being here after lunch. A robust conversation over lunch. I could hear the liveliness in the atrium where we ate, and we'll try to make it equally lively here. But to do so, you're going to have to ask us questions and interrupt and sit on the edge of your seats and not have that postprandial kind of letdown that I find characterizes me in an afternoon. So let me talk at a very high level about what, from the vantage point of CGS, we see as emerging trends in graduate education and graduate international research collaborations. But I want to start this conversation at a place that you might not be expecting, not an emerging trend, but a long-term reality. And that is the importance of international students who study in U.S. graduate programs. And what I ultimately want to make as a pitch is that as we think about creating more global competency for our own U.S. students, we think about ways of more deeply engaging and capitalizing on the experience that our international students bring to our campuses. So, high-level facts. It will be, I think, in the press next week, the third annual survey, third phase of our international survey. And what does it show? It will show that about 17.5% of all U.S. graduate students are international students. I could give you all the statistical caveats. That's, if anything, is probably a slight underestimate, but it's pretty close. You probably know from your own personal experience that in some programs on your campus and many, many campuses throughout the nation, the proportion of international students is much higher, particularly in engineering and the physical sciences. This year is, I think, the third or fourth consecutive year of near double-digit increases in overall graduate enrollment. I think when all is said and done this year, there will be a 7% increase in the number of international students studying on our campuses. It's interesting, however, that this is perhaps an emerging trend, that growth is actually is being shaped by a recalibration in the countries from which we have drawn our students. For the second year, there is some flattening in the number of applications and admissions and first enrollments from China. I by no means would suggest, oh, my word, crisis, the Chinese are not coming to the U.S. anymore. Clearly, we are in a more competitive environment with Chinese institutions themselves increasing in strength and reaching world-class status. There are still a high increase in a high volume of Chinese applications to the U.S., and clearly the U.S., in the terms of students studying outside of the country, is the destination of choice. But the Chinese contribution is flattening, it's decreased a little, offset by an enormous surge in applications from India. And although the base rate is much lower, Brazil has nearly doubled its enrollment in U.S. graduate programs. So what do you make of that? What's the message to us as we start thinking about globalization in the international context? For me, it's a pretty powerful and positive thing to think about an even more geographically diverse mix of graduate students who come to our campuses and help shape the culture of research and knowledge and disciplinary inquiry. For anybody who's worried in a research office about too heavy of a reliance on any single agency funding stream, you'll know that we encourage people to pursue across a variety of agencies, and it seems to me the same strategy holds true here. And my bottom line conclusion, as I said before, is that the U.S. remains a highly attractive destination of choice for graduate programs. Let me give you a couple of other things you might not know, but you will if you read the CGS new press release next week, or you may already know it depending on your vantage point on your campuses. Enrollment in business programs remains one of the highest enrollments for international students, but there's been a pretty significant decrease in the number of international students pursuing master's degrees this year. Numbers something like 30%. So there's been a real decrease. Again, remember it's big, but it's an area that's showing some volatility. As you would expect, engineering and physical sciences, including computer science and mathematics, show the greatest surge in both applications and first-time enrollments and total enrollments. But I want to point out that enrollments in the humanities are also up. I think about 4%. This is pretty interesting in the context of so much of the popular press and attention given to the pressure on the humanities and shrinking domestic enrollments in the humanities, to start seeing evidence of what I take to be renewed international interest in the kinds of more liberal arts and humanities fields as contributing to the national good, reflecting itself out in slow but gradual growth. And by the way, the same thing is true of the social sciences. I think a 5% increase in the social sciences. So we've got a healthy pool, and I want to return to the idea that at least this is one piece of our globalization strategy we might really want to do some more thinking about. But I think mostly the thrust of today's conversation is helping our U.S. students increase their global competence and their global experience. And I'll just give you results of a couple studies and projects and leave you once again with more questions I hope we can discuss than answers. The two sources of data come from a 2010 publication that CGS did on joint degrees, dual degrees, and international research collaborations. If you haven't seen that publication, you can ask Henning. He can point you to the website. There may even be copies in the graduate school now. That study was based on 2008 data. And our most recent study comes from a survey of our members, responded to by 55% of our graduate deans, a pretty healthy response rate, in which we really tried to ask them to help us understand not just joint degrees, but what other programmatic initiatives did they have on campus, and what results were they seeing as a result of those initiatives that were designed to increase global competence. So let me start out with the latter study and summarize it briefly this way. You can challenge me if I've got it right. I would say that the overwhelming results from this survey is that globalization and international experiences remain a highly valued but optional piece of graduate education in the U.S. When we asked deans about whether any programs on their campus had any international requirements, 64% said none. That there were no programs on their campus that had any required international or global experience. When we asked them what were the most frequent types of international experiences that were available to students, simply tallying how many of the respondents said that such opportunities were available on their campus, I think probably you wouldn't be surprised to know that a plurality reported that international research experiences were available on their campus. Short-term study abroad were also very frequently present on campus, and field experience, which probably has some overlap with the international research experience. So the numbers are 61% of these institutions had international research opportunities, 61% had short-term study abroad opportunities, 58% said they had field experience options. Interestingly, if you parse the data, I think probably, again, not surprisingly, those universities who responded that were high research universities had a higher proportion reporting the availability of these international experiences. So 93% of high research universities said yes, graduate students had opportunities for international research. 91% said yes, they had opportunities for international field research. 64% said short-term study abroad. Interestingly, medium-term or long-term study abroad, specific language study were much less frequently reported as available on campuses. Now, that finding to me in itself is interesting. Clearly, I think if you're thinking about the University of Minnesota, you would be reflecting how do we stack up vis-a-vis the high research universities. But to me, there's a pretty interesting question implicit there. High research universities have a larger mix of doctoral as opposed to master's programs, which means it is likely that it is doctoral students who are having the international experiences, not master's students. It's unclear whether this is a function of programmatic necessity for international experience or if it's a resource constraint. And I think really trying to begin understanding on a campus that mix, who of your graduate students are participating in which ways, and are the overall findings a function of the different constellation of students and programs, or are you really seeing differentials in the interest of students and of faculty in supporting students? So a pretty substantial proportion of the deans in this most recent study also said that their campus had one or more dual or joint degree options. In fact, 48% reported at least one dual or joint degree on their campus. The previous time we had data on this, again, came from that 2008 survey, at which point about 31%. Not directly equivalent because the respondents were a little bit different, but I still think it gives you a sense that over the last 5 to 6 years there has been growth in dual and joint degrees. Probably an early mid-2005 to 2009 real surge has flattened, but there continues to be growth. What we know from the 2008 study, from the respondents, again, graduate deans responding on behalf of their institutions, is that those joint and dual degrees are much more likely to involve international students coming to the U.S. than U.S. students traveling to study in a research or do coursework in a partner institution abroad. Interestingly, faculty participating in these programs, U.S. faculty, are quite likely to travel and teach and work in research collaborations and as part of program staff outside of the country, which may suggest that some of the perceived barriers or students worry that their faculty wouldn't approve of this are not the fundamental cause, because faculty clearly are doing the traveling themselves. So when we asked deans, so why aren't more U.S. students taking advantage? What is your perception? What do you believe is the reason why more U.S. students don't participate in study abroad? Overwhelmingly, financial constraints was the highest level of a report, and I think Dr. Wilson will talk a little bit about NSF's perspective and how they think about supporting students. So 70% said that's the single biggest cause. Family work-life issues were also reported. I just can't take time away from my family and my ongoing obligations to spend a considerable period of time, probably not surprisingly. And about 45% reported worrying that studying and engaging in research abroad would slow down their time to degree. Now, this is another interesting one where if you look at the overall sample and compare it to the research intensive sample, I mean, I guess when I first read this, I thought, well, I would think that, there would be faculty who didn't want their students to go because they wanted them to stay in the lab and complete a current and ongoing project and so on and so forth. Didn't show up in the overall sample. But when you looked at the research sample, in point of fact, the major reasons the deans at the high research universities cited nearly as high as financial concerns were the sense that it would have a negative impact on local research projects. And I think that's the same thing as saying my faculty members wouldn't like it. I mean, I don't think those are two independent variables. They go together. And you can, I mean, you're starting to get a picture now. It's probably impacting doctoral students more than master's students because of the funding mix and the way we support students. It impacts those in fields, I suspect, that are lab-based more than others, where the common source of funding is research assistance. Lots of questions. I don't know the answer. I was just thinking a lot about, well, what does this mean? And I think there's some additional questions we should ask. So from my point of view, well, I would say this is our most recent data. Not sure it's an emerging trend, but it's a current reality. It seems like the implication and the next to-do is, how will we begin understanding what the policies and practices are that begin removing some of those barriers? And maybe we can spend a little bit of time talking about this. Well, I think much of our conversation, and I don't know about throughout the day, but when I go to meetings to discuss international students and recruitment of international students, whether it's actually, it applies in undergraduate settings as well, our major conversation tends to be driven by a real desire, and I would argue real need, to get more U.S. students to have the transformative experience of leaving the comfort of their own community and experiencing what happens when you shift lenses, shift perspectives, and all of a sudden are needing to approach the world in a different way. But I want us today, if we have the time, to at least consider how we might, at the graduate level, think of the creation of policies as well as practice, as well as curricula that introduces opportunities to develop global competency and international understanding for those students who, by function of life circumstances or finances, simply can't study abroad. And I'd like to tell you a little bit about one of the projects. The final publication will be out either late this fall or very early in January, from a project that I think has some promise. It has some promise specifically, but as a model, it might be something for us to think about. And the project I'm talking about now is one funded by the Ethics, Education, and Science and Engineering program within, I hope I'm going to get all these acronyms right, within the National Science Foundation, Office of International Science and Engineering. A project entitled Modeling Effective Research Ethics Education in Graduate International Collaborations. So it was very interesting to me to hear what Melissa and the panel had to say earlier today about how to approach understanding and mapping what the various kinds of ethical considerations are that our students need really to be prepared for, so do our faculty, frankly, as they start moving into more international collaborations. The project, as CGS often does, involves the crafting of a competitive research proposal sent to our member institutions with some parameters and then competitively and selectively awards are made to those campuses. The design principle around this particular initiative was that proposers needed to design, implement, and evaluate ethics education, doing so with measurable student outcomes with respect to either or all knowledge, skills, and attitudes. So what will you be able to demonstrate that students can do as a result of ethics training as it applies to ethical issues that emerge out of differential cultural contexts, ethical issues that grow out of the differential organization of the research enterprise, and finally, differences in ethical values and frameworks. Well, I'm not going to give you all the details because I don't know them yet. We're still compiling the final report, but to just give you an example of a few of the projects that are interesting models to consider. At Emory, they did a case study competition, asked clusters of faculty and graduate students to develop real case studies of real research ethical dilemmas in their discipline. And through a competitive process, tried to build out a set of resources and case studies that could be used in various science and engineering mathematics disciplines on the basis of these realistically informed projects. Northern Arizona's big exploration was, can we do this in a way that is a hybrid model of educational delivery of modules that is both cost-effective but also has demonstrated utility in mastery and deep engagement with certain kinds of ethical issues. Virginia Tech describes their project as research ethics with teeth. And what they have really moved toward is a policy that requires all new degree programs coming forward for possible approval to include in its expected student learning outcomes both the metrics and the feedback loops they will use to demonstrate that the program is helping students to effectively engage in ethical considerations in international research collaborations. They've done several other things with respect to creating an international research collaboration certificate that, again, is tied to student learning outcomes as well as experiences, with the idea that that's a value add for students. University of Oklahoma has deeply engaged in this question. Perhaps some of you will have heard the common perception that international students and U.S. students have different ethical frameworks for confronting and thinking about various kinds of ethical dilemmas. Early look at that research suggests the answer is no, and that a good conversation around ethical questions that have no obviously apparent right answer is good for international students, and it's good for U.S. students as well. So again, look forward to a best practice document later this fall, and the development, which is already, we're sort of beta testing it, an online repository of resources derived from this project. So quickly, I'm going to talk about issues on the horizon. Well, they're pre-emergent trends, I guess. I can't promise you they're trends because I don't think we know enough about them yet to call them trends. But here's what I would say are the emerging issues on the horizon, again, to repeat, for international graduate research collaborations. First, I think we need to do a much more fine-grained look at how we might address and implement not just programs, but also policies that promote the opportunity for more U.S. students to study abroad. Second, I think we really have to think creatively about how we would change our own graduate curricula in our disciplines and in our fields if we put mastery of ethical thinking in an international context as one of the core student learning outcomes we would expect master's prepared and doctorally prepared students of the future? How would we redesign and implement? Would we simply complement disciplinary learning, or would we find ways to deeply embed it in the curricula itself? I want to suggest to you again that I'm not sure that I have any quick ideas of what it might look like, but most of us have struggled with ways to find ways to more deeply benefit from the presence of our very talented international students on campus, and to do so in ways that are deeper than important cultural events. I'm not by no means taking as dismissing the importance of cultural familiarity and the kinds of things we do to celebrate the backgrounds of all of our students that make our universities rich. But to really think about ways that we can create, I would suggest it's going to happen within disciplines and within the content of coursework and the research project. It won't be simply or only professional development or brokered conversations. But to really think creatively, what does this kind of diversity mean for the kinds of experiences we can create, and how would we begin organizing in ways that are mutually beneficial for the, well, more than mutually, it's for all of our students and the institutions at large. And finally, what I think is a very, very, sort of multi-layered question is, how are we going to assess global competencies and student learning outcomes associated with international experiences? And how will we demonstrate the value of the investments we as institutions or department chairs or others make in trying to foster a more global scientific workforce? Actually, it applies in the humanities and every other discipline as well. There are lots of ways you could think about assessment. In the 2008 Dual Degrees publication, there's actually a quite nice look at the multiple levels at which we might try to document the outcomes of graduate international collaborations, from impacts on individual students and careers, to impacts on programs, to the ways in which progress in this regard redounds to the health and the prestige of our universities. And in this beautiful quotation, and Dr. Wilson, you may remember this, there's a quotation from Cora Merritt, who at that time was probably the acting director of NSF, about the power of what she called scientific diplomacy. The power of scientists engaging around topics of deep interest across our borders and to all of humanity have the capacity to influence and impact and change the political relationships between nation states. So if that's bold and it's big and it's grand, I hope that we're up to that challenge as well. I am going to close here, but I'll just tell you what our deans said about, if I can find it in my notes, I'll tell you what they had to say about ways that they thought might appropriately be used to assess learning. The most frequently given answers, I think you will not find surprising, was better career outcomes and better career outcomes and student satisfaction with educational experience. Far and away the most commonly cited. The second category was increase in scholarly output and research infrastructure. And significantly below that were things like increased language proficiency, increased professionally relevant networks, and the last one was broadening perspectives and experience. Now, my interpretation is as follows. While broadening experiences and perspectives was least frequently and the last listed on the list, it may in fact be the most important, but it showed up last as deans thought about it because they, as I expect we, can't figure out how in the world we'd measure it. And thus our trap of trying to avoid valuing, measuring, rewarding, and assessing on the basis of things we already know how to measure and are easily available versus those that would give us information that really could transform the nature of graduate education. So I'm hoping we'll have questions, but at this point, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity, and I will turn the floor over.
I think thank you very much, Suzanne. We'll turn it over to Dr. Wilson, and we'll have plenty of time for questions after Valerie's presentation today.
So thank you very much for inviting me here, and thank you, Suzanne, for a wonderful introduction to what I'm about to say. As Suzanne discussed, there is broad interest in the notion of international collaborations as being an enriching part of graduate education, but we really are not quite certain how to measure it, what we're looking for when that happens. And clearly, that's a question and a concern that's been raised by many of the federal funding agencies. Just as a backdrop, I just want to have a sense of who's in the audience. How many of you are graduate students? And of those graduate students, how many of you have had international experiences? Okay, there's some. And how many of you are faculty members or advisors of students? How many of you have had your graduate students go abroad? Very good. This is an unusual group as far as that's concerned. And so this is an important set of questions to ask, because there are all kinds of assumptions about why students do and do not participate in international experiences. And I'm now specifically talking about US-based students going abroad. At the National Science Foundation, we are very interested and invested in the support of graduate education. Our budget is roughly $7–8 billion. We invest about $1 billion of that in graduate education. However, the majority of that investment comes in the form of research assistantships that are embedded in individual researchers' grants. That's about 80% of our support. So that leaves about 20% of the support to be in specifically designated programs like traineeships and fellowships. At the NSF, within that context, the lead premier fellowship program is within the division that I manage, called the Graduate Research Fellowship Program. That is the oldest program at the National Science Foundation. Started in 1952. That fellowship program began in 1952. And since that time, every year has been awarding fellowships to outstanding individuals. Now, why is that unusual? Because the majority of the support for graduate education is done in the form of grants and investments at institutions, where the institutions then choose the students. In this particular instance, the GRF program, the Graduate Research Fellowship Program, actually asks the students, invest in the students with the potential to succeed. So therefore, this then represents a different cadre, or a certain select group of individuals who have been identified early in their graduate career as having the potential to succeed. And I want to emphasize that the support is both to students seeking a master's degree as well as students seeking a PhD. So it's not just for the PhD program. And as Henning mentioned earlier, at one time this program provided sort of a small blanket of funds to every fellow. Every fellow got about $1,000 for the purpose of international activities, and typically those funds had been used for students to go to a conference. I would suspect that in the very early days, $1,000 was a lot of money. Nowadays, $1,000 might get you one way to wherever you're going, and certainly may not necessarily support all of the activities, even if you're attending a conference of a relatively few days. So about 3 or 4 years ago, those funds were discontinued in that manner. And we began to think across not only all of the within our division, but across the directorate, about how we might redirect those funds in a more appropriate way, in a more targeted way, in being able to support international activities. Now, why focus on international activities? Simply put, we know that those kinds of experiences have a profound impact on the individual's eventual worldview and perspective about conduct of the research. But how do you measure that? And exactly then, what are the tangibles around that particular investment? We really did not know. But we're a science agency. We decided we would develop an experiment, and building on an experiment or a program that had been done by our partners within the NSF, the International Science Unit, where they had a small collaborative program going on with the Nordic countries. We decided to expand on that and build a new activity. And the new activity, and if you've ever gotten federal grants or work with federal agencies, you know that we love acronyms. The new activity is called GROW, Graduate Research Opportunities Worldwide, and that is the logo for that particular program. It was launched and announced at the end of 2012, which was, in fact, the 60th anniversary of the GRF program. And two or three various different wonderful positive streams came together to create this program. At that time, the director of the NSF, Dr. Subra Suresh, was very, very much interested in working with his equivalents across the globe, and had pulled together a global summit, if you would, on merit review. And so that was one of the influences. Another is that the NSF has had for a very long time a memorandum of understanding and agreements, partnerships with various different countries. And then, of course, arrived the 60th anniversary of the Graduate Research Fellowship Program. And in very short measure, a new initiative was created. And I want to tell you a little bit about the initiative, the what about the initiative, what our experience has been, the process has been over the last 2 years. We're now starting our third round of these fellowship opportunity, and then really leave you with some of this, having you to help us try to figure out what would be the appropriate questions to ask and what kinds of measures we might put in place to understand the impact of this particular redirected investment in international research collaboration. So the GROW program, has these particular goals. Introducing fellows to international research opportunities early in their careers, building research capacities, forging long-term collaborations, and contributing to professional development and future career opportunities. Pretty lofty goals for this particular program. And let me go back a second and make certain that I tell you about a little bit about the GRF program. As I indicated, these are fellowships that are given to individual students. It's very competitive. This year, we're anticipating in excess of 14,000 applications for approximately 2,000 awards that will be given. But the students who apply are eligible to apply as senior undergraduates, first-year graduate students, and before the beginning or the completion of their second year. So this is very early on in their graduate education. For certain disciplines, they may not have even chosen their final research mentor. But it's intended to be a fellowship to the student that would allow them to use 3 years' worth of funding in any 5-year period of time that they would be in graduate training. And it also allows portability. That is, if a student starts in one place and for whatever reason that's not a good fit, the student is able to move the fellowship with them to the newer institution. And given that they have 5 years in which to expend or be active on the fellowship, they can elect to be on tenure 1 year, off tenure another year to do a variety of other things, and then back on tenure and so on and so forth. So we wanted to take advantage of this 5-year span to have an opportunity for students to participate in international research collaboration so that they can do it while they're either on tenure, that is being supported by the NSF, or not on tenure, because there may be different flexibilities that might be allowed to them. So back to the story about what this process is about. As I said, we launched it in December, and it provides for 3 to 12 months of graduate research experience. And we initiated this by hosting it in the countries that you see highlighted there. And then in the second year, we developed a partnership with the USAID so that students could participate in research experiences in these developing countries. And there are a couple of them, Brazil in particular, and India, where there are the regular GROW fellowship opportunities, internship opportunities, as well as USAID opportunities. And those opportunities are mutually exclusive within those countries. So in a sense, it expands the possibilities. And this is just a depiction of where the host countries are. We started off in the first year with 8 initial countries. Those are highlighted in red. We added 7 new ones in 2014. And then there are also 7 partners with the USAID opportunity. This year we've added 2 additional countries. So this expands the list to nearly 20 different countries in which the NSF has memoranda of understanding and agreement with these countries for specific research opportunities for the individuals who have been awarded a GRF fellowship. Now, we're doing this within the context of the GRF Fellows to sort of as a controlled type of an experiment, if you would, because these are now individuals that have their own fellowship dollars. They're not necessarily dependent on the RA dollars from the PIs. So it removes that variable from the conversation at the moment. And it gives us a appreciable pool. Right now, we have about 8,000 active fellows from which we can then particularly solicit applications for these opportunities. Now, after the first round of applications, and let me just give you some statistics. In the first round, since it was done relatively quickly, in a very quick turnaround, we had about 75 applications and 57 students were awarded the fellowship. In the second round, we got close to 200, about 225 applications for a combination of the USAID opportunity as well as the original GROW opportunity, and close to 160 students were actually awarded those fellowships. What do they get? What they get from the NSF is a $5,000 supplement to offset their travel and other sort of activities to settle in the country. What they get from our partners are all of the other costs that are needed to support their stay in country. Now, if they take their fellowship with them, and then that is, they can take their fellowship with them and use their fellowship while they're in country, in the other countries. Or alternatively, if the other countries will provide them with a stipend, they can then go off tenure from the NSF GRF fellowship, and the countries will support them for the housing, the research activities. So it's a pretty lucrative kind of opportunity and can range from 3 to 12 months, depending on the particular research site. So before the students left in the first rounds and then also in the second round, we asked them a variety of different questions really to understand the population of individuals who had applied and to begin to ask some of the questions that we had heard were some of the issues around why students do or do not participate. I understand that these are now a pre-selected bunch of people who have applied, and of course now these are the individuals who have been selected. But we asked them a range of things really to either understand, to prove or disprove, or really to have brought a sense of what some of the factors were in making their decisions about that. And the participants' thoughts around that, I think, are particularly compelling, where really these individuals are really seeking the opportunity to learn about different cultures, to understand whether and how their research directions will fit into the larger global context. So there is innate in everyone, particularly in this arena where research is no longer a local, isolated type of activity, to really want to be able to see the generalizability of research and research efforts and to build partnerships and collaborations. And among this group of individuals, the advisors were not the problem in terms of going into research opportunities. But again, this is a self-selected group of individuals because these are the ones who actually have applied. So we're really looking to beef this up, this kind of discussion, this kind of set of interview questions of the individuals, and then ask some of the similar questions when they return to really see whether and if and how some of their attitudes may have changed or been a little bit different. And these slides will be available to you after the seminar, but I want to make certain we have enough time for some conversation. Some of the longer-term questions that we want to understand are very similar to the kinds of things that Suzanne brought up that were asked and answered by the deans. That is, what are the, not only what were your experiences, but to what extent that the fellows who participate in these collaborations differ from students who don't participate in these types of collaborations. And what are the outcomes? Not only did the research go well and were you able to operate in the context of this differing environment, but then what are some of the long-term implications of the work internationally? And how do you measure the outcomes of such a program beyond the individual students' participation for the 3 to 12 months? We're really trying to understand the degree to which this actually becomes a frame shift or a different perspective. How do you characterize the differential perspective that an individual student has when they are able to conduct research in the context of a different culture, a different environment, a different set of parameters? So we're going on with this particular experiment. The individual program officer, who is the lead for that, is now on an outreach tour to really excite people about applying for this opportunity. We hope to have at least every year 200 to 250 fellows who would have the opportunity to do this. That would represent maybe 5% of the total fellow pool. And more importantly, we're hoping to be able to be thoughtful about assessing the outcomes of their research experiences to understand what the benefits are of investments in students doing international collaborative research opportunities, not only for the students immediately, but for their long-term career, and also any potential benefits that may accrue to the laboratories, both the ones that they have come from and the laboratories to which they go, in having that student be a part of the research effort. So that's what I really wanted to tell you about the experiment that we're conducting, the opportunity that's available for any student who is a recipient of a Graduate Research Fellowship Award. And we are committed to try to continue this and study this as we go along, so that we are better able to contribute to the overall conversation around graduate student professional development and the role that international research experiences may have on their professional development and training. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Valerie. And we are in the dialogue phase. Any questions, comments? Up there.
Hi.
Are we being understood without microphone, or do we need a mic? Okay.
Great. So thank you for your talks. They were really interesting. I am an international student myself, and I'm a student from India. So you spoke about the surge in numbers and I contribute to that surge, I'm guessing. I'm doing a master's in international development, which interestingly and luckily enough is very internationally focused. But a lot of what you were talking about was talking about the value and emphasis of international collaboration for American students and universities. And I'm wondering, in your talks with deans and at universities, what is the emphasis on the international experience and the collaborative experience for the international student, and if any, really?
Here's my candid assessment. We have had good conversations, and graduate deans, deans of business and elsewhere, have really thought long and hard about two pieces. One is, what advocacy work can we do to create more opportunities for international graduate students to gain work and paid internship experience as part of their graduate program. Of course, we're also very interested in the question of increasing the number of H-1B visas, extending study periods post-degree. So I would have to say those are really the two main areas where I see real thought and work, particularly, again, I think in the advocacy sphere, because these are legislative, not just university policies. I think when I listen, and Henning, you in some ways would be another reflector on this, that when I hear people think about international student experience, they will talk about two or three things without, I think, having some specific concrete things to do next. They worry about high concentrations of international students from the same country in one or two labs, so that rather than having the sort of experience that pushes you out of your culture, you allow people to fall back into the same culture. So there's a lot of thinking about what should we and what could we do. I would say that the general response has been to talk about it, and then to encourage various kinds of social activities, often having to do with connecting international students to host families or trying to figure out ways to engage them in social activities. I think those are really important. I really don't want to downplay those, but I think we ought to really be able to think about how we can structure some deeper kinds of relationships. And I don't know exactly what that would look like. Are there ways we can really build seminars into our programs that really have an international dimension, that asks students to engage deeply in conversations? I mean, the ethics stuff lends itself to this beautifully. How would I approach navigating these kinds of issues in my career? What can I learn from one another? But I'm quite certain there are other topics as well. I just haven't heard, Henning, and maybe you have, of people who are really making more progress in this regard. And this is one I think clearly where international students themselves can bring to their departments and to their graduate deans more ideas about, this would be really meaningful if we could do X, Y, and Z. Here's what's missing in my experience that I'd like to think about.
We have one very promising development here on campus. We have the Council of Graduate School, of graduate students. And now we also have a Council of International Graduate Students that is working together with COGS, which is sort of the umbrella organization. But I think we'll be very active in promoting exactly these things. It's CIGS, and I think it's been a very fortunate measure and event that this group makes itself now more visible and contributes actively to graduate education and its organization on our campus. And we have a very large international graduate student group here. More questions? Yes, please.
Dr. Ortega, I have a question. It seems more like your knowledge of our considerations, but what kind of factors have pushed deans to promote international research education or international research? I know university leadership will be very complex, based on complex, board of regents, provost, president, many stakeholders around graduate school. But according to your observation, what kind of motivation or factors have pushed many deans across the country in promoting international research collaborations?
I think it's the simple observation that careers, business and academic careers no longer take place within the confines of a single nation or a single lab, that as work becomes more funded and centered around what I often call the grand challenges, that understanding those in a multicultural and multinational context is absolutely fundamentally to any hope to solve those problems. I think it's our understanding of the way science and scholarship is produced. It's not an individual enterprise, hasn't been for a long time, it really can't be. And really thinking about ways of coordinating efforts to answer questions. It's certainly the notion driven by our economic competitive agenda, the sense that what will we lose if our universities and nations around the world do a better job of promoting global literacy and thus a healthier international business environment than we do. So I really think it's this sort of a political context and an economic context. There's also the changing nature, the changing organization of the way new knowledge is produced.
I think the federal government has the same rationale for doing so. Rather than continuing to invest in individuals who are broadly trained in their discipline, but narrowly trained in the cultural context in which research is done, I think the investments in particularly moving U.S. students into other arenas gives them a visibility, a sensitivity, and a connectedness to the global economy and to collaborators in other places that might in fact foster the generation of knowledge in a more meaningful way. It will be unusual in the future for any knowledge generating laboratory to have researchers and research only conducted in one particular culture, in one particular environment.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. This was very fascinating and speaks to a lot of the issues that I've been thinking about for a number of years. As I was mentioning before the session started, I have been directing an internationally focused graduate fellowship program here on campus at the Interdisciplinary Center for the Study of Global Change for a number of years. And we think about a lot of these issues around questions of global perspective and global competencies in research training. And so first is a comment and then is a question. The comment is, you ask about our feedback on what works in these areas. One of the things we have found that works, and it's not always easy to implement, but some kind of a sustained interaction among cohorts of students, among communities of students. We really have a community of scholars that only very broadly have a shared research focus. It's very interdisciplinary. They're from everything from public health to feminist studies across natural, biological, social science, and humanities. But they all have a shared commitment to the global south. Now that's pretty broad, right? The global south and social justice. But they come together and they have sustained interactions over a period of 3 years in interdisciplinary seminars each year. About half of those fellows are international students and the rest are US students. And they really develop a sort of a shared understanding, a shared perspective. And so that sustained interaction piece seems to me really critical in graduate training programs. And I wonder, for example, if the GROW Fellow program that you mentioned, is there any way to bring those fellows back together for interactions after their experiences to continue that dialogue? Maybe you're already doing that, but that might be an interesting aspect.
We're not currently doing that, but that's a very interesting possibility. At the moment, there are not a lot of them.
Right.
So it would be easy to begin to do that and to use them as an opportunity to not only build camaraderie among those individuals, share their experiences from the various different countries, but also to inform our program in a way that would make it a lot more desirable and more meaningful to the future participants.
Yeah.
So again, that's a very good idea.
Yeah, and our students do find those relationships continue then on as people they can turn to. So that's just my thought. But then I have a question. Neither of you mentioned gender in your discussion of these opportunities and how students take them up and how they experience them. Do you have any data or impressions about how gender plays into these questions of whether students participate, how they participate, and what the outcomes educationally are for them?
Our gender balance is, there is a balance of genders participating. I haven't looked at it more deeply to look across various different disciplines, but I now know to go back and do that.
But you mentioned, one of you mentioned work-life, family balance, and so that triggered for me the question of, are there additional considerations for women who are in graduate training programs, or have there been?
You know, I don't know the answer to that question. It's an obvious one. Between the two of us, we'll cook something up to get us to facilitate a conversation around this and see what we can find around national data. That's an excellent point.
Well, NSF has a major initiative on what we call career-life balance, and has instituted career-life balance resources for individuals, but not necessarily in the context of international research collaborations specifically. That's an interesting point. We do have money, for example, to offset people on parental leave, whether it's men or women, to help back hire a technician for a short period of time to keep work going, but that's all based on the U.S. institution. It's not necessarily based on an international research opportunity.
So I'm on a GRF and I'm looking into applying through one of the USAID partners this coming round. And just from communicating with the host institution over there, one of the problems that I might foresee is funding of the actual project, because certain types of research are much more expensive than others. And so it's kind of like going in a little bit blind, and I'm not totally sure what the funding situation is like going to be for laboratory supplies and everything like that. And my question is that are there other funding streams available through NSF or USAID to help fund the research projects once you get on the ground in the host institution?
And the answer is yes, and I'll give you my card and we'll talk specifically about that, but USAID has assured us that they will make certain that there's appropriate resources for the opportunities that you're applying for, but let's talk about that offline.
If you look at doctoral programs in Europe, Australia, a lot of the Commonwealth countries around the world, they're a lot less coursework oriented than we are in the U.S. Are any of you aware of experiments in the U.S. to add some flexibility into coursework requirements that might facilitate more international experiences?
Well, actually, I'm coming from one of these environments that you just described. I guess you can tell by my accent, probably. One of the things that we've promoted here in Minnesota, as much as we can, as just an overarching umbrella institution as the graduate school is, that doesn't really directly interfere with curriculum, we have created, together with the campus community, policies that now have a maximum credit requirement for PhD programs, a cap, with the notion in mind that students who come to graduate school actually like to do research, and that's why they come primarily, and they want to identify this object of their curiosity or subject sooner rather than later. And we've also tried to, for example, have ways that graduate students can take thesis credits right when they're walking through the door of graduate school, provided the advisor and the program find them research ready. That was not possible in the old days, so to speak. You had to take those after the pre and oral, even if you had done the research, or most of the research already before that. So yes, we are really trying to promote that. And in that context, I have a question actually for you. And Suzanne, you mentioned that the graduate deans have responded to questions of whether they had optional or required programs for international experiences or for homely global competencies on their campuses. And my question to you will be, do you think anything that is an international experience should be a required or mandatory additional component of the graduate program, or should it be handled in a in a different way. I'm asking this because every time when I have conversations with graduate students or I present at our Senate committees that have graduate students on them, just the last time we talked about an internship initiative that would open doors in the Minneapolis area for PhD students and master's students to take their research there and interact with potential future employers. The first question I get back is that another requirement that we have to do? And I would really caution to frame this as, oh, yet another course or requirement to become more international. I mean, I admit my international experience was totally transformational and changed everything except my accent. So yes, I am very much in favor of that, but what is your opinion on how to best incorporate that in the curriculum or in the research experience?
Well, one thought, it needn't be international, but perhaps an intercultural experience.
Yeah. Other thoughts?
I've been sitting and listening to the talk all day, and there's all these talks and funding and so on, and NIH is big, and NSF is big, and I just can't help wondering where I'm from the art department. And I've been involved in an international interdisciplinary project with scientists in Japan for the last 5 years. And I've been experiencing a huge budget difference. I mean, kind of the budget the science is working on is few digits different from funding the artists will get. So I'm just kind of, I can't help but to wonder where does arts fit into this equation of internationalization when we have no money to even travel from Duluth to Minneapolis.
Well, NEA, I have recently discovered, will in 2015 and 2016 celebrate their 50th anniversary. It's an agency, you know, that has had enormous political pressure and enormous budget cuts. But it might be interesting to try to engage with our colleagues in what is the premier national funding association around this question. What role does international collaboration and around the artistic and cultural enterprise play in here, thinking about the next 50 years? So I will make it, I actually have an appointment with the director. I'll make it a mental note. I'm going to ask with no promise. Which is all a long-winded way of saying I don't know. I don't know where the funding agencies are thinking about this.
The reason I brought up the contemporary art is such a global activity, and the access for our graduate students to go to, Asia or Europe or Africa to experience their cultural perspective is great, but if we don't mandate that to the graduate student, I don't think most people would be able to afford it.
I just wanted to bring up a point I made in an earlier session. It's something I think a lot about, and that's the creation of entry points for graduate students to engage in international experiences without having to have had previous international work. I find that my students that are most competitive for international fellowships or scholarships are those that have already done something international. And as you pointed out, many undergraduates don't have the financial resources to even study abroad, so that makes them less competitive when they're in graduate school to be awarded some of those international fellowships. And those that do get the international fellowships have already had experience. And so it makes me wonder, how can we create more points of entry for graduate students to have almost what's the equivalent of a study abroad experience, but doing graduate level things, maybe engaging in research, et cetera, in graduate school, and not have to have had experience prior experience internationally to be able to do that.
I have to say that East Carolina University has been, primarily it's an undergraduate initiative, but has been creating a course, a virtual seminar. Now you got to get the timing right. There's some real difficulties, but through Skype and various kinds of telecommunication, they really have a research-focused course that brings together students from 3 different countries. And I know they've done Japan, the US, and South Africa. Somehow they found the sweet spot in the time zone, I don't know, but they've worked, and they now have 5 or 6 years of experience. And what they know is that students who participate in this course are more likely to go on to take foreign languages and to engage in other international experiences. So when I think about requirements, I can't imagine we would think about ways of, mandating a study abroad or mandating coursework, but this idea that a program has to address in planning their student learning outcomes, something that speaks to some kind of understanding about the cultural context of the discipline, sounds like the kind of thing that you could justify on solid academic grounds, and it becomes part of the curriculum, not an add-on.
Yeah, one other comment on this point is that it occurs to me that something that would be a really interesting project to undertake is something similar to what we did here on this campus about 20 years ago, where we had some funding to internationalize certain core undergraduate courses. And, in keeping with what you're saying, Suzanne, would be every department has their professional development course or courses for graduate students. Why not undertake a similar initiative whereby departments and faculty are encouraged to incorporate an international component to those professional development courses that may or may not exist at this point? It just would be an interesting way to encourage not a required experience, but required or encouraged attention to the topic of how do you collaborate internationally, how do you build international networks, and draw on some of the faculty expertise that certainly every program and department has. But that's just thinking of the model we used to internationalize undergraduate core courses years ago.
Here's another thought maybe for, and I think we talked about that before, but for NSF. When you look at emerging trends in internationalizing graduate education, and you look at what's happening at the funding front in Europe, there's very little, if any, fellowships available at the federal or national level in countries that allow graduate students to take their money and go abroad. Doctoral students and master's students, doctoral students mostly. But what is available, or what is increasingly created there, are what is called international research training groups, where groups of faculty that have a similar interest come together, apply for a grant that will last 5 years or so, with a lot of traineeships in it, and they find a partner group of faculty at a university in the US, in Canada, or in Brazil, or wherever, that is thematically close. And so they have a joint research interest, because I think that is important. In the end, your graduate experience is revolving around a research topic. So those students who are in these international research training groups go at least for 6 months to that partner faculty group outside of the country, and are really truly immersed in not only the research environment, but in the entire daily life culture, so to speak. And there's actually a study going on right now that compares those students who did go for 6 months and those who did not go for 6 months. There's no difference in the amount of papers that the group published. The usual bibliometric data don't show any difference, but the qualitative feedback that is coming back from those students who went abroad is just mind-boggling. So the experience that these students have in their host countries is apparently one that moves them to the next level personally and professionally. So that, I don't know if the NSF is planning to sort of, because you talked about how much money is in the fellowship pot and how much in the traineeship pot, is planned to be moved to more of a core model of supporting international exchange.
Yes, this is a question, I would say, for the panelists, but also everyone in this room who's concerned about graduate education, and that is what I see as an increasing need for us to advocate for improved foreign language education in the undergraduate and high school level. So I was struck by one of the slides that you put up, Dr. Wilson. Almost all of the GROW participants had traveled abroad, almost none spoke the language. And so when we advocate for international experiences, that's one thing, but it's very different to have that experience of being marginalized in a lab or marginalized on a research project because you don't speak the language very well. And very few US students have that experience because English remains so dominant. So how might we address that issue of privilege and power that continues even when we send our US students abroad?
That's a very good statement, and I don't know that I have an answer to that specifically, but it really talks about building the capacity a lot sooner for any successful career in terms of being able to understand and learn a different language. I would agree with you.
I don't have an answer to your question, but every time I turn on the news recently, I was thinking that something in the late 1950s propelled the U.S. to make heavy investments in national defense education, offers, I think, NDEA fellowships, and those fellowships clearly were language and regional and cultural studies as well as in the sciences. And it would be interesting to know how media scholars ought to understand how the rhetoric and the dialogue around the Cold War era was able to generate sort of this real commitment to the need for deeper scholarship and understanding, while the opposite seems to be happening now in an equally volatile arena that has political and national security issues. Why hasn't that understanding translated backwards in the same way? I mean, there might be some lessons we could learn if we went back and really sort of looked at framing language and how, who is on point and how did that happen? Because to me it's just inconceivable that this isn't a similar kind of situation, and it's so obvious.
Well, to that point, our former Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice, her proficiency with Russian allowed her the opportunities that she was afforded, and added to her value as Secretary of State, being able to communicate with not only the Russians but others. So there is something to that with our language competency, where you're headed with that. So there needs to be some definite emphasis put on that in that area.
And if we look at daily politics, we can be quite optimistic to have Cold War conditions back again.
Oh, good.
And on that positive note, there's a question.
Yeah, actually, not question, just a few thoughts there. Particularly since you mentioned Russia. I actually came recently to Minnesota, and I still run Russian Center Initiative at Arizona State University, be part-time involved there. And our recent project is organizing their online education workshop. And working on this, we just came an idea. Why don't we just create their online hubs at the various places in other countries where they can exchange the content and also would provide access to each other students potentially. And I would just sit in here so that would be idea which help solve many problems if they're on a graduate level students. And actually, if there is interest, I can help implement this idea to create such online hub for undergraduate to graduate students, where they would be communicating with similar centers and initiate such centers in potential area where the students want to go, so that prior to going there, they will get experience with this environment, both cultural communication, and it would be very small investment because such labs already exist everywhere. So all you need is just to connect to the screen and have a camera and microphone. That's all you need. And this in all countries, not even in rich countries, there's plenty of labs of this kind. And you can easily, the only thing you need is a little bit of experience, international collaboration, and help to create such networks between students, hubs in various countries, and then you solve many problems which were addressed here. And at one point, another point, since I collaborate quite a bit with U.S. Embassy in Moscow, they're quite actively involved in Fulbright
our scholarship. Basically, they bring students from their country here. Your collaboration, your program with in the backwards with embassy would probably help a lot, because I know that, for example, to create the abroad communication for students like US, you have to go through a qualification your program at the university, and a highly bureaucratic program. Often, I would, not like make anybody, but basically these people who do evaluation, they've never been in this country. In order to kind of make it more secure, they create tons of paper. Instead of, if you communicate with the US embassy there, they know everything on the place much better than these guys who create tons of paper for qualification, their potential partners. So, and particularly those who are involved with Fulbright, they communicate with university. This cross-population could help a lot.
I'm sure there's a lot of things we can do with e-education in addition to physical.
Absolutely. And I would say that the students participating in the USAID aspect of our growth program actually are given an orientation by the USAID about the country, the conditions, a variety of other things before they go.
I'm sure we could go on for another 19 minutes, and I'm really thrilled and delighted by the livelihood of the discussion, by the fantastic presentations. Valerie and Suzanne, thanks again for coming at short notice, both of you from DC for just one day. We really appreciate your coming and your presentation and all the information given. Thank you again.
Yeah.
It was snowing.